I got to work here in the House of Commons, being something called a parliamentary page. Okay. Now, for those of you who don't watch CPAC on a regular basis, you may not know what parliamentary pages do. But for those of you who are political science graduates, I know there's a few of you in the room, you may not know this if you're not actually studying political science at this time. Parliamentary pages in Canada actually technically run the government. They do two critical jobs. Number one is they get members of parliament water. Now, you watch these guys on CBC or whatever during question period and they yell at each other a lot. Well, somebody has to make sure their voice doesn't go hoarse, and that's us. Now, I was trained by using your taxpayer dollars on how to deliver water in both official languages for 3 weeks. And my first day in the House of Commons, I was so nervous, I was actually shaking. I spilled half a glass of water on Jean Chrétien. Thank you. I got some clapping. That's very kind of you, guys. That's very kind of you. Thank you. So that was number one. Number two, I was coming out of high school, first year of university, and the other job we would do is deliver notes, handwritten notes from members of parliament. Now, coming out of high school, I was always getting confused, because in high school, when I deliver notes, you get in trouble, right? You get called over, you have to read the note out to everybody. In these guys, they have people deliver notes for them. This is how parliament works. It's so interesting to see how laws are made. One day, a member of parliament called me over. Walked over, water, note, what would you like, sir? And he asked me a question. He asked me this question that I had never been asked before, that we never asked our young people nearly enough, which I would especially like to ask all the young people seated here this evening. He asked me a question, and he said, Mark, what type of legacy do you want to leave? And I'd never been asked that question before. I said, what type of legacy do I want to leave? And I kind of scratched my head and looked down, and I said, sir, I guess if I work really hard and train and really become effective, I'll become a senior page to tell all the little pages where to get water and stationery. And he was so unimpressed, he asked me the question again. When teachers do that, sometimes they just want to ask you again. So he asked me again. And I said, I don't know. He said, okay. He said, I work as a board member of this amazing international organization that works in the slums of Thailand that are looking for Canadian volunteers. He said, what do you think about maybe finishing Parliament and finishing your job and going off to Thailand to help change the world? He said, what do you think? And I was like, wow. You mean I could leave my job here in Ottawa and go change the world? And I said, no way. I said, that's really kind of you, and I really appreciate the opportunity, but I'm having a great time. I'm spilling water on world leaders. I'm having this great experience. Why on earth would I leave my cushy job in Ottawa and go all the way to Thailand, of all places, to go change the world? And he said, okay. But here's the thing. I went off, and every single day he'd call me over. And he never wanted water, he never wanted stationery, he would always ask me this legacy question, this L word, until he literally broke me down. And I finally, after 10 conversations with this gentleman, finally said, fine, I will go 2 weeks. And he got all excited, he said, okay, fantastic. And after this conversation, I went off, and after my opportunity, to my new home. This was my new home. It was the Klong Toy slums of Thailand. Dilapidated row housing, corrugated iron roofing, people living off less than $1 a day, people living in absolute poverty by the United Nations statistics. And I was there, and I went up, and the volunteer coordinator at this charity I was working with, called the Human Development Foundation, met me, and she said, Mark, what do you want to do? What can you do? And I explained very proudly I used to work in Ottawa as a parliamentary page. And she said, oh, okay. She said, okay, parliamentary page, okay. And she said, please go report to the AIDS ward. So I packed my bags, and I walked in to the AIDS ward. And 2 nurses came up, they were tiny women, one literally hugged me, and she had a big smile on her face. And she said, Mark, thank goodness you're here, you're a doctor, right? And I was like, oh no. So you must have got me mixed up with another volunteer. She said, there's another volunteer? I said, I hope so. And then she said, okay, so you understand basic, medicine, you're a medical student, and I said, I'm a political scientist. And she said, okay, you understand basic anything about medicine, and I said, I watch ER every Thursday. I have good knowledge. Okay. I said, okay. They said, okay, no problem. They looked down at our watch. We're going to teach you medical school, and they said, we have about 4 hours. And I called a timeout, and I was like, oh, this is so wonderful. Thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you for teaching me medical school. See, Canada, my country, very cold. 4 years, medical training, 4 years. And they said, okay, we'll start right now. And so we started right away. And I learned my medical training in about 4 hours. And I learned how to move people who had bed sores, how to administer IVs, how to administer basic medication, everything you would want to know in 4 hours or less. At the end of my 4 hours of inaugural medical training, they looked down and they said, okay, Mark, now that you're trained, we haven't had a volunteer here in 3 months. So if it's cool with you, there's 2 things we need to tell you. Number 1 is on the left-hand side of the ward, separated by those movable walls, curtains. Left-hand side of the ward, there's an area called the exit area. So when people get really, really sick and they're about to pass away because of Buddhist society, we wheel their beds towards the exit because death is something very sacred in Buddhist society, so we don't want to have everybody see them die. And I said, okay. And this is the second thing we need to tell you, as mentioned, is we, again, haven't had a volunteer in 3 months, so we're going to leave you with the ward, and we're going to take the next shift off. And we're going to make sure that you guys are okay. And they patted me on the back, and they said, good luck. And I said, oh, no, see, I'm not feeling really good. They said, this is the beginning, they said, of your residency. And they walked out. So, ladies and gentlemen, after my 4 hours of inaugural medical training, I was now in charge of 24 patients. And I was starting to type about it. So I was breathing through my nose and my mouth very quickly, trying to calm myself down. That's what you're supposed to do, right? You're supposed to calm yourself down and try to bring everything to perspective, okay? And I said, Mark, you can do this. I'm going to give myself like a coaching pep talk. You can do this, you can do this. I said, Mark, what do you know how to do really well? What do you know how to do really well? And all of a sudden, a light bulb went off. The first thing I did is I got everybody a glass of water. And then I said, what else do you want to do? And that was the end of my list. So what I did is I did what exactly you guys did. I walked around and gave everybody high fives and high tens. And I just wanted to bring a smile to the face. That's literally what I did. Long story short, my first inaugural shift, the left-hand side of the ward, again, that exit area of which I spoke, one of the gentlemen in that area, was there because he was obviously very sick, and he had fluid in his lungs, and he had pneumonia. And for those of you who are medical students, you know that HIV or AIDS is not actually what kills you. It's your CD4 count or your white blood cell count goes down so low, so you can't fight off something called an opportunistic infection. So basic colds or flus would actually be quite catastrophic. So he had a very, very low CD4 count, and he had virtually no white blood cells, and he had fluid in his lungs. And I was supposed to go help him when he was choking, and he started to choke, and I gave him this medication, and he kept on choking, and I gave him some more medication, and he kept on choking, and I needed somebody to come help me. So somebody to come actually walk into the ward with me, so I could administer this medication, and I could like literally prop open the back of his neck, so his esophagus would open up, and I could administer this medication. And I ran outside in the main street in the slum community that are separated by those windows. And I first asked, and then I begged somebody to come help me, anybody. And everybody kind of looked at me funny, and most people spoke broken English. But nobody walked in the ward because they all thought even if they stepped inside the ward, they might get AIDS themselves. So I did what I fundamentally believe that you would have done, anyone you would have done, seriously, because you're obviously people who care. I went back with this gentleman, and to my disappointment, still, to this day, I actually did not know his name, and he passed away in front of me. And I was holding his hand. And this was my first experience dealing with that. And seeing somebody close their eyes for the last time was an incredibly humbling experience. And I just broke down. And I was crying, and I was so upset. And I was standing over this gentleman when the nurses came back, and they said, Mark, what happened? And I explained what happened. And they said, Mark, somebody dies here every day. At least he died with dignity and respect. And they said, let's go back to work. And I stopped them, and I said, do you not understand what happens here? And I was so emotional, I was upset, and I was crying, and I explained, I looked into them, and I said, thank you guys so much for what you do. Thank you for truly being the change. Thank you for your work, thank you for your efforts. I just can't do this. And I gave them a hug, and I walked out. And I went to the volunteer coordinator, and I picked up the phone, and I called my mom. And I said, Mom, I need to go home. And she called me back. She said, Mark, there's a flight in 2 days. You're on the standby list. I said, thank the Lord. I am going home. And I went upstairs to where I simply had unpacked hours ago. And I went upstairs to pack my bag. I wanted to leave so badly. And I was packing my bag, and I was actually going to sleep on the floor of the Bangkok airport. I was packing my bag, and what happened is this boy here in the yellow t-shirt came up, and he knocked at my door. And he said, Mark, what are you doing? I said, I'm packing, I'm leaving. And he said, Mark, what are you doing? And all of a sudden, it hit me like a ton of bricks, because somebody had told me a week before I had gone to Thailand, a week earlier, that when a boy or a girl from Thailand in the slums speaks perfect English, it's not because they went to private school, it's not because they went to school at all, it's because they used to work as a sex slave for a foreigner. And this boy spoke perfect English with the European accents, and he said, Mark, what do you do? And I finally started to listen. And I said, I'm leaving. And he said, you can't leave. And I said, why can't I leave? And he said, I'm a street kid. And he pointed down to his feet. And he said, I don't actually have shoes. And he said, but that's okay. He said, I'm a street kid, and I actually don't even know when my birthday is. And he said, but that's okay too. And he said, what we do is that we have a whole bunch of friends who are young people who are street kids. And we have a street kid student council, street kid council, where we all come together because we don't know when our birthdays are. We don't even have shoes, but what we do is we all come together and we choose one day as all of our birthdays. We choose one day as all of our birthdays together, and we have one big collective birthday party. And he grabbed my hand, and he made me walk downstairs next to where there's a gravel pit where we played soccer with a whole bunch of street kids who all spoke perfect English, who none of them had shoes, and instead of using a soccer ball, we used a Coke can. And at the end of the soccer game, the most incredible soccer game I've ever had, it was so emotional, it was so eye-opening for me, coming up from Thornhill, Ontario. They came up to me and they said, Mark, you have to come to this birthday party. And somehow, reluctantly, I don't know how, but I did. I said, fine, I will go. And I went up to this volunteer coordinator again. I picked up the phone yet again, and I called my mom yet again. And I said, Mom, those of you who are parents who can appreciate this, I said, Mom, I hate to do this to you, but I need you to change my plane ticket again because I need to go to this birthday party for street kids with those people. My mom's a teacher. We grew up in Thornhill. We're pretty straight-laced kids. My mom said, Mark, I need you to be very honest with me. Are you doing drugs? I said, Mom, no, of course not. She said, okay. So she changed my plane ticket. 2 days later, I went to the coolest birthday party you could ever imagine. I went to street kids who don't have shoes. And it was a birthday party not through a lot of stuff. We didn't have a big cake. We didn't have big presents. But it was the coolest party ever. And at the end of the party, they made me promise I'd stay longer, and I did. I changed my plane ticket again, and then I changed it again, and I changed it again, and I changed it again, and I changed it again. And I spent just under a year living and working on this island. And every single morning, I got my butt out of bed to play soccer with a bunch of kids who didn't have shoes. And every single day, I eventually got myself back in the ward where I had many people with HIV or AIDS pass away in front of me at some count. But I came back to North America, and you know what? I was upset. I know some of our friends who have been to some of these developing countries volunteering, and sometimes you have these experiences, so you can have them right here in St. Catharines. You go to the food bank, you understand these issues, you go back to your friends in your schools. I know so many of you are young people, and you go to your friends and say, do you realize what's going on? And they say, really? Can we just go to a dance party, or can we talk about whether Britney Spears is cool or not? You know, and there's such a disconnect. And you guys are obviously different because you're here, because you're people who care. But there was such a disconnect for me, and I came back and I was really mad. I was really pissed off. And I went to my friends, and they didn't get it. So I said, you know what, I'm either going to do things that I'm going to really decide whether I'm going to make myself an activist now, or I'm going to educate myself as much as humanly possible so I would understand these issues, so I could tackle the root causes and do everything I could. And thankfully, I chose the latter. And I got a scholarship to Harvard and a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford. I'm a lawyer by training. I don't practice law, but the reason I share this again is what I said previously. I learned more about compassion, leadership, globalization, a whole bunch of factors and issues from a bunch of street kids in Thailand that didn't have shoes than I did from many of my professors. Sometimes the greatest teachers through the latest experiences in life can be those you least expect, and sometimes not necessarily in the textbook. But also, it's so important to me, and I'm sure it's so important to many of you, how critical it is, this is my little diatribe here, I apologize, but to finish school, and to finish high school, and to go to university or college. If that's your calling, to do something really important, because if you want to tackle these issues, you need to understand them firsthand. And that was my choice. And thankfully, that was a choice that I did make.